The evidence bag looked like a harmless detail until he saw what was clipped to the keys. It was 1998 near Frozen Head State Park in Tennessee, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, and a survey worker sat under buzzing fluorescent lights while a deputy slid the plastic across a metal table. Inside the bag sat a simple key ring, but the ring carried a white plastic cap marked with a number, like a tag from a system nobody had ever admitted existed. Earlier that day, 3 work trucks had climbed a narrow service spur to document illegal dumping, and a man had stepped out of the brush as soon as their tires started failing in sequence. He didn't shout or threaten at first. He asked for paperwork, then asked for keys, then took what he wanted while another vehicle crept up behind them with its lights off. When the workers tried to leave, the road itself seemed to fight back, and the only path that stayed open led to a hidden clearing with more drums than anyone reported and signs that other crews had made the same mistake. One of the men never came back down the mountain. The survivor did, and he learned that the numbered caps weren't trash or markers for a trail. They were a count. Here's what we actually went through out there. My name is Bennett, and this happened to me back in 1998 near Frozen Head State Park in Tennessee. We met at a gas station in Wartburg at 7:10 a.m., and the day looked ordinary enough to make you feel embarrassed for taking warnings seriously. The sun sat low but bright, the lot smelled like warm asphalt, and a couple of locals moved around their pickups like they had nothing to do with anything outside town. Our 3 work trucks sat in a line by the air pump, each one loaded the same way, hard hats on the dash, clipboards in the cab, orange vests folded on the seat. Deke drove the lead truck because he ran our field crews and liked to keep eyes on everyone. I drove second because Deke trusted me to stay focused and not drift off course. Vance drove the third truck because he was new and hadn't yet learned that the mountains don't care how confident you feel. We had a state work order for environmental documentation. It sounded simple. Take photos of suspected dumped drums, log coordinates, confirm access routes, then leave before the afternoon weather or the locals got curious. The flyers on the window changed the mood as soon as you noticed them. 2 men, both smiling in work photo lighting, both framed the same way as if they'd been printed from a company directory. The text under the pictures asked if anyone had seen them. It named them Bryce and Len. It listed a date range that wasn't long enough to feel historical and wasn't recent enough to feel like an emergency siren anymore. That is the dead zone where people stop calling every hour and start telling themselves the problem might fix itself. Vance stood there reading it like he expected the words to rearrange into an answer. Deke came up beside him, saw what he was staring at, and didn't say anything. Deke had a way of going quiet when he decided something mattered. He just walked inside and paid for ice, water, and 2 cans of tire sealant, then came back out with the kind of calm that only shows up when a person is forcing it. The clerk watched us from behind the counter the whole time, and when we stepped inside again for coffee, he didn't wait for small talk. He slid a cup toward Deke and nodded at our trucks through the front glass. "Y'all headed toward the park," he said. Deke answered with a short yes. The clerk leaned forward and lowered his voice without making it sound secret, like he'd said it so often it didn't need drama. "Roads back in there don't belong to nobody," he said. "But some folks act like they do." Vance asked what happened to the men on the flyers. The clerk didn't smile or shrug. He kept his hands on the counter and said, "Truck got found, them didn't." Then he looked at Deke like Deke was the only adult in the room. "If a man tells you to take a different road, you don't," he added. "And if your tires start acting strange, you don't stand around fixing things up there. You come back down." Deke thanked him, not warm, not rude, just direct, and we walked out with coffee that suddenly tasted like something you drink before a bad meeting. We reached the park area a little after 8 a.m. The public spaces looked normal, which made it easy to doubt everything you just heard. A couple loaded day packs. A kid pointed at a trail map board like it was a treasure chart. I saw a ranger truck move through the lot and thought how unfair it was that some people's job is to keep the peace in places that don't want peace. Ranger Hollis met us near a maintenance vehicle and asked for our paperwork. Hollis looked tired, not sloppy, just worn down by the kind of problems that don't resolve cleanly. Deke explained the job, and Hollis listened without interrupting, then unfolded a park map and traced a route with one finger. He tapped a spot that wasn't labeled for visitors. "That spur is an old access," he said. "It's not on the public map. It's narrow, it washes out, and it creates problems. You stay together. If you hit a gate, you turn around. If someone approaches you, you get back in your vehicles and leave. You don't debate. You don't explain. You leave. Vance asked about the missing men again, and Hollis didn't correct him or soften his answer. "Stay on the route I'm giving you," he said. "Don't split up even for 5 minutes. If you see something, you mark it, photograph it, and you come out." He didn't tell us we were safe. He told us how to avoid being easy to handle. The pavement turned to gravel within a few miles. The air cooled as we gained elevation, and the road narrowed until it felt like the trees pressed in to listen. Deke kept a steady speed, slow enough to avoid ruts, fast enough to avoid lingering. I kept him in sight. Vance stayed behind me, sometimes too close, sometimes too far, the way people drive when they're trying not to look nervous. We passed a few trailheads and empty pull-offs. We passed signs warning about closures and backcountry conditions. Nothing about any of it looked like danger, which is how danger works in places people treat as harmless. At 10:15 a.m., Deke pulled over at a fork to check the paper map again, and I parked behind him. Vance rolled up behind me and leaned out his window. "You think those flyers are real?" he asked. I told him nobody tapes fake faces to a window for fun. He nodded like he accepted that, but his eyes stayed on the woods, and I could see him doing the math he didn't want to do, trying to connect missing men to our work order. We took the left fork onto a spur that wasn't labeled for visitors. Hollis had called it an old service access, but it didn't feel abandoned. It climbed harder than the main road and narrowed fast. Brush scraped the sides of our trucks. The surface changed in patches, old packed gravel interrupted by fresh crushed stone that looked recently poured. Those patches sat in the ruts like someone had used them to level something or hide something. The fresh stone was bright, sharp, and out of place. The kind of detail your brain files away without fully understanding why it matters. Around 11:05 a.m., we passed a pile of household trash on the uphill shoulder, an old mattress, busted chairs, torn bags, the sort of dumping that makes you angry because it's lazy and it ruins places that don't belong to the dumper. What caught my attention wasn't the trash. It was a straight line of white plastic caps laid along the shoulder, evenly spaced, all the same size, clean enough to look new. Deke radioed back, "Seeing markers. Keep it tight." Vance hopped out when we stopped for a second, stared at the caps, and asked why someone would do that. Deke told him to get back in the truck. Vance obeyed, but he kept turning in his seat to look at the caps as they disappeared behind us. We found more lines of caps as we climbed, always along the uphill shoulder, always evenly spaced. They didn't look like litter. They looked like a measuring system. By noon, the spur had the uncomfortable feel of a place someone maintained without permission. Deke called a stop at 12:20 p.m. at a wider spot where an old cut road branched off to the right. The cut looked newer than it should have. Brush had been trimmed back. Tire tracks ran into it with the clear edges of recent use. Deke opened his tailgate, handed out sandwiches, and kept his eyes on that cut road like he wanted to make sure we all understood it. "Eat fast," he said. "We get the photos, we get coordinates, we get out." Vance asked why we had to do this ourselves instead of waiting for the cleanup crew with more people. Deke gave him the truth. "We're not here to pick it up," he said. "We're here to document it before it disappears. If someone's dumping, someone may be watching." Then he pointed at the cut road again. "None of us goes down that," he said. "It doesn't matter if it looks like a shortcut. It doesn't matter if it looks maintained. It's not on our instructions." Vance nodded hard, almost too hard, like he needed to prove he understood. At 12:50 p.m., Deke stopped again and got out with his camera. The first drum sat upright against the uphill bank, half hidden by ferns. A second drum lay on its side farther back, dented and rust-streaked, with a scraped area where a label should have been. I got out with my camera and handheld unit, stayed careful about where I stepped, and worked the way we were trained. I photographed the drums from multiple angles, recorded coordinates, and noted access conditions. Deke found a third drum deeper in the brush and photographed that as well. Vance stayed near his truck at first, then wandered closer with the restless energy of someone trying to convince himself he belongs. Deke didn't scold him. He just worked faster. After a few minutes, Deke stood up and said, "That's enough." "We go now." He sounded like he'd reached the point where the job objective no longer mattered as much as leaving. We turned back toward the trucks, and I saw the first sign that someone else had been in control before we arrived. Fresh, crushed stone lay scattered behind my rear tire. It wasn't a natural washout. It wasn't something we'd driven through. It looked placed, like a thin patch laid across the road. Vance asked if we hit it earlier. I said no, and Deke crouched down to check. He brushed the stone aside with his glove and revealed a scrap board buried underneath. Nails punched through it, points up, positioned exactly where a tire would roll. Deke slid the board out by its edge, careful not to press down on it. Whoever made it chose nail length with purpose, long enough to reach sidewalls. This wasn't a prank, and it wasn't random. Deke's face tightened, and he didn't raise his voice, but his tone changed. "In the trucks," he said. "We're leaving right now." We started engines and rolled forward, but we didn't get far. Deke's truck sagged first, not with a bang, just a sudden softening that pulled his front end toward the ditch. He stopped. I stopped behind him. Vance stopped behind me. Mine went next, then Vance's, the same slow collapse, as if air was pouring out in a controlled way. Deke got out, looked down the road, then looked back behind us. I stepped out and saw a second nail board placed behind our trucks, positioned to catch anyone who tried to reverse. The boards created a trap both ways, and the fresh, crushed stone hid the forward board until we rolled over it. I didn't see how the second board got there. I only knew it wasn't there when we drove in. That was when I noticed the man on the bank. He stood above us where the brush met the tree line, still enough to look like he'd been there for a while. He held a flashlight in his hand, pointed down, but turned off. He started down the slope at a steady pace that didn't match panic or anger. It matched a person approaching a task he'd rehearsed. Deke stepped away from his truck and raised his hands in a calm, open posture. "We're leaving," Deke said. "We're just changing tires and leaving." The man stopped a few yards away and spoke in a flat voice. "You're on the wrong road," he said. "Who told you to come up here?" Deke kept his tone even. "State contract," he said. "We documented dumping. We're heading back to the main park road." The man's eyes flicked toward the drums in the brush. His mouth tightened like he'd tasted something sour. "Show me your paperwork," he said. Vance leaned close to me and whispered, "Is he a ranger?" I whispered back that he wasn't. Rangers don't disable 3 trucks. Deke reached into his cab for the folder on his seat, still, trying to treat this like a boundary dispute. "We can call Ranger Hollis," Deke said. "He'll confirm." The man's gaze went straight to the radios in our cabs. "No calls," he said. Then he lifted his hand and pointed past us, down the spur. I turned my head and saw a vehicle rolling up from below with its lights off. It stopped near the nail board behind us, angled like it intended to block the road. Someone sat inside. I couldn't see a face. I just saw a head shape, still, watching. The man on the road pointed toward our trucks again. "Keys on the hood," he said. "All of you." Deke didn't move. The man took a step closer, and his calm thinned. "You think I'm asking," he said. Deke tried to de-escalate, voice steady, not pleading. "We're not here to take anything from you," he said. "We'll forget the drums. We'll turn around as soon as we can." The man's jaw tightened like Deke had insulted him by implying negotiation. Without warning, he walked to my driver door, reached in, and pulled my keys from the ignition. It happened so fast it didn't feel real. I reacted on instinct and grabbed his wrist. He responded faster, driving his elbow into my ribs and shoving me backward into the ditch. Pain lit up under my ribcage and stole my breath. Dirt filled my mouth. I pushed up on my hands and looked at him, and he stood over me like I'd proven something he already believed. He pulled a length of chain from his pocket and clipped it to my front bumper, then clipped the other end to his belt like he planned to lead my truck away on foot. The chain wasn't a random tool. It was part of his method. He looked at Vance and pointed. "You," he said. "Come here." Vance stepped forward without thinking, then stopped like his body remembered the flyers on the window. The man's voice stayed flat. "Now," he said. Vance took another step. Deke said, "Vance, don't." The man snapped his head toward Deke and said, "You keep talking and I'll put you on the list." Vance asked, "What list?" The man didn't answer. He grabbed Vance by the sleeve and yanked him toward the bank. Vance tried to pull away. The man slammed him into the side of Vance's truck, hard and efficient, knocking the air out of him and dropping him to the gravel. Deke took a step forward, then stopped himself, torn between helping and not escalating. I could see him trying to calculate what saves one person without losing three. I got my knees under me and looked for something I could use that wouldn't get me killed in the next second. My camera bag sat on my passenger seat. I couldn't reach it without stepping into the man's space, and my keys were gone. Deke's truck sat with the driver door open. The folder was on the seat. The keys were still in the ignition. Deke glanced at me, and I saw the decision land. He moved like a man committing to a plan he hated. He sprinted for his driver door, climbed in, and turned the key. The engine caught. The man saw it and released Vance for a half-second to pivot. That half-second gave me my chance. I ran to Deke's passenger side, dove in, and slammed the door. "Go," I said. Deke hit the gas. The truck jerked forward on half-flat tires, rims grinding on rock. The steering wheel fought him. The man ran alongside us for a few steps, chain swinging, reaching for the door handle. He missed by inches. Deke swerved just enough to keep him from getting a grip. We bounced over the patch of crushed stone and over the first nail board, and the tires finished collapsing. Sparks jumped from the rims. We kept moving because stopping meant we'd be handled the way Vance had been handled. I twisted in my seat and looked back through the rear window. Vance lay near his truck, not moving. The man stood over him, breathing hard, then looked up and locked eyes with me. His face held no panic. He looked like a person who had decided we were objects in his system. Then he turned and sprinted to the second vehicle. Deke pushed our crippled truck around a bend and drove until the rims made the ride unbearable. Every second felt like we were ripping the vehicle apart. The spur narrowed, and I could feel the truck sag and drag. Deke's hands shook on the wheel, not from fear alone, but from the strain of controlling a truck that wanted to fail. Then he made the decision he'd warned us against. He cut onto the side road, the newer cut we'd noticed at lunch. He did it because the main spur behind us belonged to the man with the chain now. The cut road dropped steep and narrow through thick brush. Deke drove only as far as he had to, then killed the engine, and we sat in silence that felt heavy and wrong. Behind us, a vehicle rolled onto the cut and stopped. No headlights, no honking. Just a presence blocking our way back. Deke whispered, "Out." We moved fast. We grabbed water, a first aid kit, the paperwork folder, and a flare Deke kept in his door pocket. We left the cameras because we didn't have time, and that choice still bothers me because the job was documentation, and we left proof behind. We slid off the cut road into the trees downhill, moving quietly and keeping low. My ribs hurt with every breath, but pain wasn't the problem. The problem was that we didn't know if the man would follow on foot, and we didn't know if the second vehicle carried someone else who knew these cuts better than we did. Deke led because he had the best sense of terrain, and because he didn't freeze when decisions got ugly. We moved downhill toward anything that looked like a maintained service road, because maintained roads meant other workers, other radios, other eyes. After what felt like too long, the woods opened into a clearing that didn't look natural. Tire ruts crossed it. Brush had been cut back. Scrapboards sat stacked near a stump. It looked like a work area, not a campsite. And then we saw the drums, not 3, dozens, some upright, some on their sides, some split open, some covered by tarps held down with rocks and wood. The scale of it made my mouth go dry. This wasn't casual dumping. This was a site someone used repeatedly, maintained, and protected. We saw other items scattered around as well, things that didn't belong to trash, a hard hat with a company sticker peeled halfway off, a pair of stiff work gloves, a battered camera case with a cracked latch, a crushed cooler. Deke stared at the hard hat like it had spoken. "That was Bryce's," he said, voice low. I didn't ask how he knew. He knew because the flyer photo had burned into his memory the same way it had burned into mine. Near the edge of the tarps, a shape lay partly covered as if someone tried to hide it and then stopped caring. Deke took one step toward it and then froze. His face tightened and his eyes watered in a way he tried to disguise by looking down. He didn't need to speak for me to understand. "We keep moving," he said, "no matter what." He said it like a rule, not advice, because rules are what you cling to when your brain wants to break. A footstep sounded behind us, deliberate and close, and it didn't belong to an animal. Deke spun, flare in hand, and the man stood at the edge of the clearing with the chain in one hand and my keys in the other. He held the keys up like a reminder of control. He had followed the cut road because he knew exactly where it led. The cut road existed for this. He looked past us at the drums, then back at Deke, as if he was annoyed we'd seen the center of it. "You didn't listen," he said. Deke raised the flare, but didn't light it yet. "We're leaving," he said. "You let us go." The man's mouth moved into a small, humorless smile. "You won't," he said. "You're too careful." Then he stepped forward and lifted the chain as if he planned to end the discussion with force. I didn't wait for Deke to debate. I grabbed Deke's sleeve and pulled him toward the downhill edge of the clearing, toward thicker brush and uneven ground. The man moved quickly. He swung the chain at Deke's head. Deke flinched and threw an arm up, and the chain clipped his shoulder instead of his skull. Deke dropped to one knee, breath knocked out, face tight with pain. I yanked the flare from his hand, scraped it hard against a rock, and it ignited in a burst of harsh light and thick smoke. The man jerked back and raised his arm, blinking. The flare didn't make us brave. It made him hesitate. That was enough. I hauled Deke up by his jacket and we ran downhill, flare in my hand, smoke trailing. The slope turned steep. Leaves slid under our boots. Branches grabbed at our sleeves. My ribs burned. Deke's breathing turned ragged. We didn't talk because talking wastes breath, and breath was survival. Behind us, the man followed for a short distance, fast enough to stay close, but he didn't close the gap the way he could have if he wanted to tackle us right there. He didn't want to chase blindly downhill where his footing and his control might fail. He wanted roads. He wanted traps. He wanted places he'd prepared. That told me something important. He didn't rely on strength alone. He relied on planning, isolation, and control. The slope eased, and a wider gravel service road appeared ahead with fresh tire ruts and a maintained ditch line. It looked official. It looked like the kind of road park crews used. We hit it at 2:35 p.m., stumbling, flare still smoking, and nearly fell from the sudden change in footing. A park maintenance truck sat around the bend with its engine running. Ranger Hollis stood beside it with his radio in hand, posture tight, eyes wide. He took in the flare, the dirt on our faces, the blood on Deke's shirt where the chain had struck him, and my hunched breathing from the rib hit. "What happened?" Hollis asked, and his voice sounded like a person who already suspected the answer. Deke pointed uphill, words coming fast now that he had an audience with authority. "Man with a chain," he said. "He disabled our tires. He took keys. Another vehicle blocked the road. Vance is down. There's a dump site with more drums. There's at least one body." Hollis didn't waste time. He stepped between us and the direction we'd come from, like he could block the mountain by standing there. He keyed his radio and called for county deputies and state investigators in a clipped, professional voice. He gave coordinates. He gave a route description. He didn't ask for permission to treat it as an emergency. Deputies arrived, then more rangers, then state personnel who looked like they'd been pulled from desks and told to bring evidence kits. A medic checked Deke's shoulder and wrapped it while Deke fought to keep his face neutral. A different medic asked me to take slow breaths so he could evaluate my ribs. I told him I could breathe, and he didn't argue, but he watched my eyes because he knew stubborn men lie about pain. Hollis went uphill with the first group because he knew those spurs and because he didn't like leaving problems to other people. They moved with numbers, with radios, with procedures that make a place feel less personal and more controllable. They found Vance where we left him, but he wasn't there anymore. A deputy told me later that they found signs of a struggle, signs of drag, and nothing else that ended the uncertainty cleanly. They searched until daylight failed. They brought dogs. They brought more people. They found no living person and no body. That fact didn't feel like hope. It felt like an unfinished sentence. They found the dump site and documented it the way professionals document a crime scene, methodical, careful, quiet. They found Bryce and Len, or what remained after weeks outdoors, and they treated it with the kind of careful respect that makes you realize how long those men had been out there while everyone else kept driving past the gas station window. They also found more evidence than we ever could have collected, items that tied the site to repeated use and repeated contact with workers who didn't come back down the way they went up. They located the man by following the second vehicle and tracking tire impressions down toward a shack just off the boundary where parkland met a patchwork of private lots. His name was Coy. He wasn't a ranger. He wasn't an employee. He hauled waste for cash and dumped it where he thought no one would look, and he protected the site because exposure meant prison. His method was simple, and that simplicity is what still makes my skin crawl. Nail boards hidden under fresh stone to kill tires without warning. A second nail board behind you so you can't reverse. A cut road kept open to funnel disabled vehicles toward a clearing he controlled. A chain ready to keep you close and stop you from running. A second vehicle with no lights to block exits and keep you from calling for help without feeling watched. He didn't need supernatural tricks. He needed isolation, timing, and a willingness to use violence without emotion. Deputies took him into custody before sunset. They recovered the second vehicle and searched his shack. Inside, they found a 5-gallon bucket full of keys, dozens of rings tangled together, each one tagged with a white plastic cap. Each cap had a number written inside. The caps we'd seen lined along the road weren't random. They were part of his measuring system, his way of marking distances and staging points, and the numbered caps on the key rings were his inventory, a count of how many times he'd taken control of a vehicle that didn't belong to him. That night, in the Wartburg station, I sat under fluorescent lights with dirt still ground into my hands. Deke sat beside me with his arm in a sling, eyes fixed on the tabletop like he didn't trust himself to look at anyone. Hollis stood by the door, face closed, listening as if he needed every word to match what he'd already suspected. I gave my statement from the beginning. The caps, the fresh stone, the nail board, the second board behind us. The man's calm voice asking for paperwork. The second vehicle rolling up with its lights off. The chain clipped to my bumper like my truck was a captive. Vance on the gravel. The clearing full of drums. The shape under the tarp. The chase downhill. The flare. The service road. Hollis's face didn't change much as I spoke, but I saw his jaw tighten at the same points mine did. When I finished, a state investigator slid a clear evidence bag across the table. "These are yours," he said. Inside the bag sat my keyring. Clipped to it was a white plastic cap I had never owned. I stared at it, confused for a second, because my brain didn't want to accept a final insult after the day we'd had. Then I saw the inside of the cap through the plastic. A number written in black ink. 1. I looked up at Hollis, and he didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who finally had a piece of proof that matched the ugly shape of what he'd been dealing with. The investigator told me they found dozens of caps in the bucket, each one numbered, each one tied to a set of keys. Mine had been tagged like the rest, like it had become part of Coy's system the moment he touched it. That small white cap wasn't just a marker, it was a message. It said we were the first in a sequence he controlled, and if we hadn't gotten out when we did, we might have ended as another number in a bucket. Coy went to prison. The dump site was cleared. The spur road got blocked off with a real gate and clear signage, and the state talked about procedure changes as if procedure can seal every crack. They never found Vance. They called him missing and kept searching until the searches turned into periodic checks and then into quiet file updates that don't make the news. I left that region not long after, and I never took another job that required me to drive up an unmarked spur with only a map and confidence. People sometimes ask me what I remember most, expecting me to say the chain or the nail board or the moment Vance went down. I remember those, but what stays with me is simpler. I remember the clean white cap spaced along the shoulder, laid with care on a public road like somebody had built a private system inside land that didn't belong to him. And I remember the number inside mine, because it was written calmly, like the man who wrote it assumed he would get to keep counting.